let's talk about the kind of town you pass through on a work trip. You know the kind. You've left the city behind, and the landscape has opened up into something flat and agricultural. And the GPS has routed you down a 2-lane state highway instead of the interstate, because apparently that's faster. And by the time evening comes, you're in a town whose name you'll struggle to remember the next morning. A water tower, a grain elevator, a gas station with prices that seem like they're from a different decade. And right there on the edge of town, because there's always one, a small motel with a sign out front that lights up in pieces. So some letters work and some don't. And the vacancy sign is definitely on. That was Carla's situation on a Tuesday night in October. Carla was a regional sales rep for a medical equipment company, and her territory covered an enormous swath of the upper Midwest. She spent a significant portion of her working life in exactly this kind of scenario. Small towns, rural hospitals and clinics, motels that didn't need to try very hard because there was simply no competition. She was 41 years old, and she'd been doing this job for 9 years. She was comfortable with the road. She was not easily rattled. But this particular Tuesday night rattled her. The motel was called the Starlight. It had maybe 15 rooms arranged in an L shape around a parking lot. The kind of classic single-story roadside construction that looked like it had been built in the 60s and maintained just barely enough to keep the roof from leaking. The office was at the near end of the L. The woman at the front desk was elderly and moved slowly and seemed mildly surprised to have a customer, which told Carla something about the establishment's typical occupancy rate. She paid cash. She always paid cash at these kinds of places. Old habit from a colleague who'd warned her years ago about skimming on rural card readers. She got a key attached to a heavy plastic keychain with the number 11 on it, and the woman pointed her toward the far end of the L. Room 11 was at the absolute corner of the building, which meant it was as far from the office as it was possible to be. Carla pulled her car around, unloaded what she needed for the night, and went inside. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Brown carpet that had been vacuumed into submission but would never truly be clean. A bed with a comforter that was aggressively floral and aggressively scratchy. A TV bolted to the dresser. An air conditioning unit under the window that ran on its own schedule regardless of what you set it to. A bathroom with a shower that took 4 minutes to get warm. She'd slept in 100 rooms exactly like this one. She noticed the car as she was unloading her things from her trunk. It was parked 3 spaces down from her. A dark blue sedan, an older model, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that the engine was running. She glanced at it briefly. Couldn't see the driver clearly because of the angle of the light. Figured someone was sitting in a parking lot with the heat on, which wasn't particularly remarkable. She went inside. She ate a sandwich she'd bought at a gas station 2 towns back, answered her emails, took a long shower, and went to bed around 10. She was tired. She had an early appointment in the morning. She woke up at 2:17. The waking was sudden and complete, the kind that happens when something external has interrupted your sleep. She lay still and listened. The air conditioning unit was running. The parking lot outside was quiet. Then she heard it. A door, not slamming, closing. The soft, deliberate close of a door that was being shut carefully, right next to her, through the wall. Room 10, the room directly adjacent to hers. She thought, okay, a late check-in, that happens. She listened to the sounds. Footsteps on carpet. The kind of sounds that a person in a motel room makes when they're settling in for the night. The sounds moved around the room for a little while and then went quiet. She went back to sleep. In the morning, she got up early, showered, made the terrible in-room coffee, and went out to her car to load up before heading to her appointment. The dark blue sedan was still in the parking lot, engine off now, no one inside. She thought, Huh, and got in her car and left. Her appointment ran long, and she didn't finish until nearly 5 in the evening. She'd planned to drive on to the next town, but she was behind on her reports, and the thought of another unfamiliar motel felt exhausting. So she made a practical decision and went back to the Starlight. Asked for the same room. Same woman at the desk. Same key with the 11 on it. She pulled around to her space, and there was the dark blue sedan, 3 spots down, engine running. She sat in her car for a moment and looked at it in her rearview mirror. She couldn't see the driver's face. The windows were slightly fogged. She told herself this was someone who lived locally and used the parking lot for some reason, or a guest who'd also stayed a second night, or any of a dozen reasonable things. She went to her room. She ordered a pizza from the one place in town that delivered, answered more emails, watched a show on her laptop. Around 9:30, she got up to go to the bathroom, and as she passed the window, she parted the curtain slightly and looked out at the parking lot. The sedan was still there, still running, and there was a man standing beside it. He was tall, and he was standing in a way that she could only describe later as purposeful. He wasn't walking to a room or toward the office. He was standing in the parking lot looking at something. She followed the direction of what he was looking at, and it took her a second to process what she was seeing. He was looking at her window. Not generally at the building, at her window. At the specific rectangle of light where the curtains were open a couple of inches. She stepped back and let the curtain fall shut. She stood in the middle of her room and did a thing that she is both proud of and somewhat embarrassed by in retrospect, which is that she thought through all the possible explanations in order, trying to find the reasonable one. Maybe she'd imagined the direction of his gaze. Maybe he was looking at something else entirely. Maybe this was entirely coincidental. She was a practical woman. She believed in practical explanations. But when she thought about 2 nights of a running car and a man who was out there in a parking lot at 9:30 at night, pointed at her window, the practical explanations felt thin. She made a decision. She called the front desk. The elderly woman picked up on the 5th ring, and Carla described the car and the man, and asked if the people in room 10 had checked in again tonight. A pause on the line. "Honey," the woman said, and her voice was careful in a way that told Carla she was about to say something significant. "Room 10 has been empty both nights. We haven't had anyone in there." So the sounds she'd heard through the wall the previous night were not a late check-in. "That man in the parking lot," Carla said, keeping her voice absolutely level. "Can you see him from the office?" "I can look," the woman said. A silence. Then, "There's a car out there running. I'm going to call my son." Her son turned out to be the local deputy. He was there in 12 minutes. When his patrol car pulled into the lot with its lights going, the blue sedan's engine revved and it pulled out fast onto the highway. The deputy got a partial plate and called it in, but the car was gone before anyone could get behind it. The deputy walked the property with a flashlight. He found, outside the window of room 10, a section of window screen that had been carefully separated from its frame at one corner. The kind of careful, practiced separation that takes patience and knowledge. He also found, in the space between rooms 10 and 11, the outside of the shared wall, a hole that had been drilled years ago and then filled with wood putty, except the putty was loose. When he extracted it, it left a narrow hole that went through the wall, positioned perfectly to see into room 11. The front desk woman was very quiet when the deputy showed her. Carla did not sleep at the Starlight that night. The deputy arranged for her to use a cot in a back room at the sheriff's substation. It wasn't comfortable, but it was the best night's sleep she'd ever had. The blue sedan and its driver were identified 3 weeks later from the partial plate. The man had a history. He'd done the same thing twice before in 2 other small towns in the region. He knew which motels had rooms with adjacent vacancies and minimal oversight. He knew the geography of invisibility. He was arrested. He is in prison. Carla still travels for work. She still stays in motels. But she always asks for a room near the office now, with rooms occupied on both sides. And she carries a rubber door stopper wedge that costs $4 and makes a room functionally impossible to enter from outside. And she uses it every single night. What saved Carla was that she made the call instead of talking herself out of making it. Every instinct she had was telling her that something was wrong. Her rational mind was working overtime to find an explanation that would mean she didn't have to bother anyone. She called anyway. She decided that being briefly embarrassed if she was wrong was an acceptable price. That decision is the reason she drove away from that parking lot. Thank you for listening. If you like this story, please consider like, comment, and subscribe the channel.